Hello, everyone, and welcome back.
Indeed, it's the fourth hour of ID24, and we're delighted to have a talk now from Renaldi, who's going to be looking at something close to his heart, which is the Internet of Things. Before I do that, though, a quick reminder that if you have any questions for Renaldi or for the ID24 team, you can tweet them to us with the ID24 hashtag. We'll be keeping a lookout there. And also we'll be pulling out a tweet that has caused the most provoking thoughts or made us smile or has asked a really great question of our speaker. And we have a 90-day JAWS license that we'll be giving to whoever that lucky person is. Quick shout out to all the team at the Paciello Group who have helped put together this event, and also our friends at Barclays Access and the Centre for Inclusive Design. And the last group I know are holding a live streaming event for ID24. So hello everybody there. I hope you're having a lot of fun. On that note though, I will now hand over to Renaldi for his talk on the Internet of Things. Renaldi.
Thank you. So hello everyone. I hope you're enjoying a lot of your time at ID24 so far. A lot of great talks so far. And now I'm going to be jumping directly into the topic. So let me just switch screen share my. Okay. Can it be seen clearly?
Yep.
Okay. Sounds good. So yeah, I'll definitely just get into it. So it's definitely a topic which many people have recently gotten interest with, Internet of Things. It's a really thought-provoking part of the whole internet sector because it brings a lot of new challenges and it brings a lot of new things basically that we need to discuss and basically take account of. And I'm going to be talking about that in this presentation and how basically you're going to be able to find solutions for the problems that I mentioned before that may be also bugging you regarding accessibility. So let's just get into it. So I'm Renaldi. I'm from Gray Studio. So let's get it. So to start off with, we firstly have to ask ourselves, why bother with IoT? I'm sure about maybe most of you have already used at least to hearing the term IoT, because it deals with a lot of things that we are dealing with these days. It's basically dealing with connected devices. It's basically a trend that's happening these days, whether we like it or not, because we see more and more things being able to connect to the internet, and hence we see more communication that are done from things to things instead of people to devices or device to people or people to people. So it's pretty interesting to see because now we can see that this brings ahead a generation of automated services towards us as a general. And hence we're further introduced to trends that are related with that as well, such as cloud computing, connected devices that provide innovation, and smartphones. They're all connected devices these days. They are all connected to one another. And we can see that these interactions are really interesting since they are what brought us many interesting innovations, such as the Google Connected Car or the Google self-driving car or many other innovations. So eventually we see that this is what is eventually building up to be one big IoT concept. Eventually, we also start to transition into from Web 2.0 to 3.0, and I also discussed that. And it's basically the idea of an enabling environment, because with IoT, we start to understand how we are able to interact with our devices better and how we are able to automate a lot of processes better. And this is what creates an enabling environment. So are we already at Web 3.0? Now, for those who don't know Web 3.0, it's basically a continuation of Web 2.0. And basically, it deals with the concept of a semantic web. So basically, it's a structured web, that pages that are tagged directly to be read by computers, as well as now we have automated processes to interpret data. Now we're able to have communication between devices, so that's able to help us do things more efficiently. Now we're able to hence have a more automated network than one that has to be maintained at all times. We can already connect mitigation services with data reading services, so that's really great. We don't have to sometimes just read data and take action, but we can actually let machines take over. And eventually we have the concept of the virtual web, because eventually we're starting to have more of a see-through web that we're able to interact with directly. And of course, we have vertical applications from potential stakeholders. So we're seeing more interactions between different stakeholders, and we're seeing more kind of like vertical action between, because we're seeing different sectors integrate into one concept, which is IoT. So it's pretty interesting to see that it is already spreading quite a long way from whence it began. So basically, now I'm going to just dive into the problems of accessibility that we are here right now. Now, one of the big problems is that technology may not be built to be accessible because, and I'm going to be talking about this more later as well, that these days it's a matter of legality versus competitiveness. Because of the very fast growing concept of IoT, accessibility becomes a problem because many competitors want to get over their other competitors just because they want to do growth hacking, because they want to be able to quickly prosper without really caring about what accessibility takes into account. And basically, because we've been seeing a lot of innovations in IoT, and they have been already going over a lot of new concepts, such as interoperability, which is also another problem that we now have, because people keep developing new applications, but they don't create a standardized method, for example, on the web itself that people should deal with. So that's a big problem, because standardization is really needed. And especially since we know that standardization is one of the biggest solutions to accessibility. But since basically we're creating much like a tree that's branching out with a lot of branches with every stretch. So basically we see that it's all basically branching out, and that's a big problem because there's no one standard that really marks what IoT is all about. So that's another problem which I'll discuss. And basically, also with IoT, we have more of a complex architecture which we need to deal with. And this is going to be a problem as well because it involves a lot of new elements that we need to deal with, such as more complex DOMs, more complex document object models. So that's also a big thing. And also, since we're implementing IoT in many different environments, we also have the problem of changing environments. So that's another problem we'll talk about as well. Of course, so we need to bring in inclusivity to this. So firstly, we need to consider the fact of inclusive rather than simply smart, because these days people are talking about smart objects, smart stuff, but we're not really bringing inclusivity to the fold. So eventually, from here, we need to also encourage a safe net. There have also been problems with accessibility that has been dealt with in regards to security. So I'm going to talk about this as well. And also interoperability, accessibility. And the most important thing is that from this experience, it's most important to create user stories, because basically most people take action based on user stories. User stories are really what motivate a lot of users to take action based on accessibility issues such as this. Basically, we need user stories to be able to continue the movement and basically to create more accessibility for other people as well, because basically we need more of those like case studies for taking in examples and many other stuff like that. So then we get into the thing I was talking about, competitiveness versus legality, because firstly in IoT, one of the biggest problems is consent, and that's going to be something that eventually we'll have to deal with as well. Of course, the consent is whether you want your documents to be taken or not. In a lot of websites, IoT websites these days, we see that there are a lot of cookies placed into websites that are able to track our information. And also in many other software, sometimes they take basically some sample data from what data we've collected. For example, if we're using a data service to collect our data. So that's also another problem that we need to deal with. And eventually, we also have profiling problems, which lead to a lot of new regulations being made. The Fair Information Practice Principles, FIPS. So that's also an issue regarding privacy as well that eventually people need to deal with as well as the HIPAA, the Health Insurance and Portability Accountability Act. So that's also another thing that will go into this discussion. And as well as the American Disability Act, because like I said before, this goes into the issue of legality as well. The ADA states that, of course, disabled people have the right to also receive uh, accessibility, because they also need to be able to experience the services of what normal people do. So that's also going to be one big part of basically this whole concept of accessibility within IoT, and of course growth hacking. So it's another concept that is also kind of like encouraging competitors instead to focus on that instead of the whole accessibility concept. And now I'm going to be talking about one of my own case studies directly. So, because who doesn't like a good case study, right? So just get into it. So this is actually one of the products that Grad Studio was working with, the Envimo, because we designed an IoT-based monitoring system to monitor pollution. And as you can see, this is one of the layouts of the website that we made for being able to retrieve the data. And as you can see, we have 3 panes, one for basically displaying all the data, one for graphs, and one for just the displaying the latest data. Actually, we started from this, and many of the websites you will see will also start with this instead. And because of the fact that these days, for example, like the iPhone, many people like the iPhone because of its simplistic design. So like in tune with what the iPhone does, many kind of IoT data retrieving companies also want to simply represent easy way to represent their data. So they just put graphs like that. But we know that this causes an issue for many people, right? It's kind of like an accessibility issue for many people. And especially when we take into account people who may have trouble having sight, or people who may have trouble with other things. So this is also a like consideration that we eventually have to make, because the concept of too simplistic will be bad for our users. So sometimes being complex in a way to an extent is not bad, because sometimes we just want to show off that we are simple, but sometimes we end up not really giving out what we really intend to give in the end for accessibility. So of course, some problems with the previous interface that I showed with, we have no audio support. We have a concept of multiple windows for people with processing problems. So people who have processing problems can't exactly maybe navigate with what's being shown in the screen, because there's a lot of things shown directly at once. And of course, there's the need to perform sequential operations. So basically, sometimes it's just easy to reduce navigation and instead just give information as needed. And so, of course, we have literary concerns such as all text on one page and data constantly updating, which is a brain injury concern. And this was also discussed in an article from the Worldwide Consortium as well, if I'm mistaken. So this was also one of the things that was discussed there. And they also discussed the fact that IoT now has a lot of data constantly updating. And this was actually one of the biggest concerns that they had, because maybe people can't exactly keep track of that. And especially for, maybe this is also a kind of like something to debate on, because the fact that as most IoT devices these days require quick mitigation. For example, like when you're monitoring air quality inside a building, especially if, for example, in more dangerous environments such as coal mines, you may expect more quick mitigation to be needed for being able to counteract what's going to happen. So this is actually also a concern, because sometimes we need data fast, but then again, we can't actually, not everyone can see quick data always being updated on one page. So I'm going to talk about that as well. And also, we see that there was a section on the WCAG, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, regarding pause, stop, hide, and auto-updating, because they state that for any auto-updating information that starts automatically and two is presented in parallel with other content, there's a mechanism for the user to pause, stop, or hide it, or to control the frequency of the update unless the auto-updating is part of the activity where it is essential. So eventually, this is one thing that we also have to pay attention to, because eventually, most IoT devices are related to auto-updating. It can come also from the home, not only from the air pollution quality. For example, like if you're wanting to control a smart thermostat, you'll also have to be able to keep being updated regularly as to what the update is and how it's going. So that's also a thing that will keep being updated as well, and eventually will be concerned eventually that we need to deal with, because we need to also design an interface that people can pause, stop, or hide, but also keep a balance between directly being alerted when needed. So alerts, of course, cannot be disregarded in this context. When we do need alerts in case of situations where we need mitigation, we of course can create a different situation for that, but we can still create a situation for pausing, stopping, or hiding the current data being updated, because sometimes people may not have exactly the same processing capability. So of course, this was one of the examples with how we fixed it as a course to WCAG 2.0. We added audio support, for example, and I'm going to show it here. I hope there's no problem with the video playing, but this is an example of this interface that we eventually created. So we can see that eventually that they can keep scrolling on the data. So that's just an example of the comments that can be made by like a service like that. So basically, that's what we've been trying to implement into our system as well. We've been trying to implement directly those kinds of audio services that can directly comment on basically what they're scrolling at. So basically, they can just scroll onto one particular data, and then the audio can read it for them, which is one of the best accessibility for example, blind people or other situations such as that. And of course, we also take into consideration, for example, that line length should not ideally not exceed 70 to 80 characters. Of course, creating standardized clickable areas, because in IoT, there are a lot of new areas these days with a lot of interactions that may not exactly be the best solution for people. So that's another thing to consider. And also highlighting important info is also needed, because there's of course there's information, for example, like alerts, whether the situation you're entering is dangerous or not, and the room you're entering is dangerous or not, or alerts basically if there is a particular device that you're monitoring which is triggering alarms. So that's another thing that we need to highlight, for example. And of course, sometimes people want to be in control of what they basically have. So basically, it's good to have a concept of also press to update data, so that doesn't update directly. Like that was one of the concerns that we had as well originally when we started to work on such an interface, because like the data updates every 30 seconds by itself. So the website will refresh every 30 seconds. So, but then again, of course, we can't have the solution for accessibility. So eventually, creating such a button for pressing to update data will be necessary, such as in these situations. So, of course, when we talk about these kinds of accessibility, we also deal with some situations such as the web accessibility coordinator. Is it needed? Is it not? Sometimes such web accessibility coordinators sometimes are debatable, because sometimes they, in most cases, like we need those coordinators, and eventually also we come to the question with whether accessibility is creative, whether should an accessibility be informal instead of facing us with, for example, like lawsuits, which may happen based on unsatisfied accessibility needs. So that's also a big question that we're having still currently. And basically, because people sometimes ask, shouldn't accessibility be informal? And sometimes, like, we do want to make it accessibility an informal thing. It should be an informal thing. So basically, it has to be like more an open source topic in regards to IoT, since basically we need to be able to get everyone's minds into it as well, instead of just thinking it for ourselves. And of course, Now we see that there's recently been a lot of new technology that's been helping us as well in regards to incorporating user behavior, such as artificial intelligence and machine learning. And in regards to artificial intelligence, you probably in the WCAG standards, already have the standard for non-text content, which is that all non-text content that is presented to the user has a text alternative that serves the equivalent purpose. But of course, we eventually also now with artificial intelligence, now we have alt text picture description. We now can be able to have algorithms that are able to now kind of like create more of an automated picture recognition system. So with algorithms that are related to artificial intelligence, we are able to now also deal with this. And basically, it's also connected to the IoT concept, since AI is basically a big concept of IoT, since basically we are directly connecting to the internet to basically find algorithms based on what's going on in the website. And especially that's really needed because in such, for example, like graphs, or for example, like in alerts that may happen in a location. For example, if there is, let's say, more of like a dangerous situation that's being shown in a room, the AI can tell us directly, and basically people who may not be able to see the picture clearly can read the description that may be provided. So it's a really great field as well, AI. So we're seeing that more and more as well being incorporated. So the alt text is basically definitely a really great step forward into making the whole concept of IoT being more accessible really move forward in that direction. And I'm going to be showing another great example of other people using the same. One of the example that I really like is Cone Smart Lifts. Cone's actually a company that also makes these lifts, and they're able to produce a lot of new things from basically the smart concept of a lift. So this is I'm going to just play a video of an example of how they're able to basically be able to have a voiceover over the like a chat bot that they have that kind of like provides live feedback on what's happening. So that's just an example of how it's done. And we can see that it's very interesting to see how eventually people are also trying to create new kinds of new methods to be able to make it more interactive for people, because not only did they manage to make it look more attractive since we use a chat bot with but we also managed to also Cone managed to also deal with accessibility issue through audio as well that's being provided, so people can just listen directly and get instant feedback on what's happening. So that's Cone's example of how they managed to make their service more accessible. Now, some aspects of CSS that are related to IoT is that sometimes we need more scalable approaches regarding mobile and computer displays, because of course, a lot of the issues that in IoT that I saw firsthand myself when I was developing my our own website for our product, as well as a lot of other IoT website problems, such as with ThinkSpeak or Amazon Web Services, is that sometimes they don't exactly take into account the scalable approach. And sometimes when we switch from mobile to computer displays, it's really needed to be able to create a constant front end page of it, basically, because people need to have a consistent web design. As I mentioned before, we need to be able to have consistency in being able to develop our website, and as well as be able to perceive what's happening on the website. So that's really needed. And basically, we have also the concept of quality versus speed. This is also a big concept in IoT, since essentially we know that in many cases there has been problems with IoT not being quick enough to load, because sometimes IoT can really place a lot of burden, especially with data being uploaded every time. And sometimes we need to create a balance between implementing too much CSS and implementing just the JavaScript being done, if we're using JavaScript or if we're using any other tool to be able to create the websites that are able to upload the data, or any other IoT-based services that may need constant refreshing or that may place a lot of burden on the processing of the computer, so on the internet. So that's also a big thing that is still being able to that is discussed these days, as well as the fact that we need to contrast our colors of how we display our data. For example, like when we put these graphs, like I showed you before on one of my company's websites. So that's also a thing that eventually will be a big issue that we will also tackle, because colors are, I'm not going to be going in this too much because it's already covered, but essentially colors is also another thing that is also considered when we're doing IoT accessibility considerations. And of course, when we talk about HTML, we have, as I mentioned before as well, we have the concept of complex document object models against the IoT world. And because sometimes we place a little too much objects on this one screen, which creates a lot of uh, traffic as well. And that's also a big consideration we need to take before we decide to be able to implement a lot of things within our website, because sometimes it's better to have just one simple update rather than a lot of different updates happening in one screen all at once, which can also create problems for accessibility, of course, since you're not all people are able to. Some people may be able to process data differently, and they may see it kind of hard to see when they see all data being rushed into one screen at once. And also the concept of area, as you know, area is going to be a big thing as well in IoT, and it has been a big issue as well recently in accessible rich internet applications. So we'll be able to see that being implemented in the next slide, and I'm going to be showing that in the next slide as well, how we're able to maintain that. And basically, we need the concept of open source APIs. As I said, it should be an open source development instead of just closed. So we need to be able to have the help from open source as well, and as well as we need to have more coherent navigation or landmarks, as put by also a lot of people. So the need for area landmark is also needed, since we are able to more efficiently navigate through documents. For example, we have so many different tools that are in IoT websites these days, such as the graph that I showed you before. Now we're able to label those graphs, and we're able to label data, for example, when needed, or header, and especially in that land. So that landmarks are really needed to be able to navigate all those things. So this is an example of area-based coding. Just a short example, not really going too deep into area. So basically, we need clear navigation with Aria. Now we have the nav role to be able to create better navigations, and we can have more live regions, because live regions are really important in IoT, since we're able to be directly notified if something is updated, or get better justification as to why something is updated and how we should deal with it. And also, of course, the concept of area relevant, which is basically the intimating the updated content to basically the assistive technology that is able to show what happened to the live area region. So that's another thing that we can also use for our website to make it more accessible, since we can give direct alerts instead of people having to, because not everyone can see what's happening. We need to be able to give them the notion of what's happening on the update, what's being updated, and basically what's happening at that live region. Why is the data being updated? And especially, is there an alert? Is there something important that I need to know, or is it still okay for the current data? Is the current data still considered okay? And of course, the big issue with JavaScript recently is that because in IoT, there's a big reliance on JavaScript recently, as well as, of course, not only IoT, but many websites as well. But of course, there's the problem of relying on JavaScripts. Sometimes people may have problems with JavaScript, or they may not operate with JavaScript. We know that most computers these days already operate with JavaScript, most Internet Explorers, but that's still a thing we should consider as well, whether we have to place emphasis on JavaScript or not, because sometimes we also have to shift to other elements such as HTML or CSS. But sometimes people need to view the data like it's okay to view the late, not exactly updated data, but sometimes people just want to see what the data looks like instead. But sometimes not having JavaScript stops them from doing that. So that's also another thing that can be fixed as well. People can switch more reliance sometimes into HTML as well, or CSS. So that's also another big thing. And basically, so you can see that we have the concept of the fact that less features plus more familiarity equals to great accessibility. And this concept that many firms at these times, or many developers at these times, lack, because they think that IoT needs to be really complex. Basically, the more features you have, the more controls you have at one place, the better it is. But as you can see, for example, from this picture I pulled up from the internet, it's not exactly the best scenario. Sometimes, especially for people who may have problems being able to process things and be able to remember what things are what, or people who may already be used to standardized processes and may not be able to take in exactly new information all the time. This may be a big burden on them because they're not exactly able to experiment, of course, on all the controls needed to create it. And that's why we bring in familiarity instead. We need to be able to pick that notion of familiarity and instead push that notion, because people want to see standardization happening. And this connects with the fact of interoperability. This was also discussed recently from the World Wide Web Consortium as well, the problem of interoperability, which is why a lot of standards haven't been idolized yet. But at this time, there are some developers that are starting to create standardized protocols. For example, like you may know Amazon's Alexa, and basically they're able to create more products that are connected to each other, especially when you consider more smart appliances connected to Alexa instead of like each developer making their own smart products connect to one another because they want to keep their competitive edge. So eventually we will have to see that they converge into one standard instead of directly implementing it onto various standards at one time. So that's also a big challenge that we'll see being tackled in the future. And eventually it's being tackled right now, actually. But we're also going to see basically how we're going to deal with less features. And also, some good coding practice of JavaScript in relation to IoT is that we need to create more focusable elements, because with focusable elements, we help them direct where basically the click needs to be. And basically we create more kind of like better ways to interact with like our website that way. And because some people may not exactly be able to focus on one thing at a time, so with focusable elements we can help those people be able to better understand what's happening on the screen, and as well as they are able to better allocate what's needed for the next step, and etc., etc. So eventually we also need to alert, because sometimes, of course, alerts are the most important thing when it comes to data that is coming in that may have dangerous potential. For example, in my case study of having air quality, if the air quality of CO2, for example, reaches over the threshold, people need to receive alerts directly. And of course, for accessibility, we cannot assume that everyone can have the same alerts. We need to create various different alerts as well, because, for example, for people, they may need, for example, audio-based alerts instead of just visual alerts. So we can create that as well. So that's what we really need in the end. We need to create different kinds of alerts as well, that can be blended into HTML as well. And of course, live regions, as I mentioned before, is very important, because we're able to directly get feedback onto what is the problem. Because, for example, if you have the problem of your data not showing up for an hour and you're wondering why it is, maybe they can just directly tell you that this is probably because your internet is off. And especially this is very important because, like I said, in those situations where you need quick mitigation strategies, you need these kinds of quick responses that are needed for these kinds of situations. You need live regions to be able to directly show you what's going on, what's wrong, and to show better to basically what's happening in these live regions, and so that people can also expect that these are the live regions. They can identify that these are the live regions, and they know that there's something supposed to happen there. If there's not, we can just tell them what's happening. And as you can see on the picture there, taken from developers.google.com, we have also like they can just alert us that they cannot connect. And they can be displayed in different kinds of ways as well. They can be displayed in speech, they can be displayed in text, and that's really needed to be able to create more of like a more standardized way of being able to alert people that way better. And of course, we have the concept of don't shorten. It's very important that we don't shorten JavaScript while we code, because there are a lot of people who try to shorten things, but sometimes it's better to leave it more lengthened as it is, the standard as it is, because sometimes shortening things only make it confusing for developers, and sometimes even for people who may be interested in viewing the JavaScript but may not exactly also understand what it means when you shorten it. So it's sometimes important to not shorten it. It may be important, okay to shorten when used for personal purposes, but sometimes when we make it available to the public, it's very important that we keep the standard going, and instead of shortening, we create the normal standard of keeping it as it is. And just a bit on familiarity as well, to emphasize it. Of course, these days with IoT websites, we have two advanced procedures, as I might call it, because, for example, in Amazon Web Services, when I try to connect with my ThinkSpeak account, or when I tried to connect with my Raspberry Pi that I was playing with before, I actually had to go through about like 46 steps. And I think that there should be more solutions towards this, especially like, for example, like create more an audio-based solution for that. And basically, this is where we need to also draw the line as well, because sometimes it's better to have simplistic instructions and preset more often to be able to connect from one device to another. And that's basically it, not only in Amazon Web Service. I'm seeing that in a lot of IoT service that I have gone through as well. And it's really important to be able to create more simplistic information manuals to be able to make it more accessible for everyone in general. Because not only for people who may be disabled, sometimes people who are starting off into exploring these kinds of tech as well may get discouraged. So that's also another thing. There needs to be more accessibility on those areas. And it's very important to create more simplistic manuals and create audio navigation if needed to be able to show how it's done. And of course, and accessibility, we know that there are many ways to display what information. For example, there can be videos or there can be audio. So that's another thing that can be done. And basically showing step by step how to do it. And of course, people may want a familiar interface, such as based on keyboard, because not everyone can navigate with trackpad, for example, or a mouse. So it's very important that we can scroll up and down and navigate through everything, for example, just through keyboard. And so that's also another feature of IoT websites that needs to be implemented, that I've tried also as well, that we need to be able to navigate through all the different documents that are needed. And also the notion of plugins. Some people tend to require more plugins in websites, for example, like Adobe Flash and many other plugins such as that. And we need to have the concept of reducing plugins, because that is basically gonna have a lot of trouble in the end for us, because if we don't reduce plugins, it's gonna eventually be bad on the long term, since it may not be accessible for people who don't really understand plugins, or may not, basically not everyone wants to install all the plugins needed. And this is an example from one of the web service that I've experimented with as well with my data, thingspeak.com. So you may check that out as well. As you can see, there are quite a lot of controls. For the experienced person, it may not exactly be a lot of controls, but as you can see, for someone who may not exactly be experienced with these kinds of things, they may need to learn how to navigate through all the different channels, for example, like private view, public view, channel settings. And that's what I'm talking about with accessibility for IoT. We need more simplistic navigation, as well as like live regions to be able to show what's being updated, and as well as basically more descriptive information, for example, from navigation purposes, such as for a better DOM or other basically focusable elements to be able to help direct what's being clicked, and basically to be able to show how it's being done. And also, we need to remember that there are socio-technological influences, such as low bandwidth connections. We need to consider that as well when we create it. the extent of CSR being done, because sometimes people, companies, sometimes the wrong thing about them is that they take it as corporate social responsibility to do this, which is wrong. And of course, we should consider that as well. And of course, we need to consider requirements on location, which is needed for every developer. They need to consider where they're placing the accessibility needs, and also to focus on open business models instead of closed business models, because it's usually closed business models that create situations which eventually lead to a lot of this neglected accessibility. And also one section on interoperability. We have different IoT devices, different standards. That's a problem, as I mentioned before. Standardization is the problem. We need to have universal controllers, and basically sometimes a lot of services these days also provide different websites to navigate. But sometimes we need to stick with one website to be able to navigate all of them, as to be able to standardize basically a lot of things at once. And also we have the security problem as well. We have the concept of vulnerability in operating from software than hardware, principle of universal as a threat, so new open standards, metadata problems. Because sometimes when we make things accessible, that not mean we're excluding the bad guys. For example, like with problem with Google's captchas, eventually they, from the usual audio and image captchas, they eventually transition to the "I'm not a robot" box, which is it's quite a big turn down from the usual security measures that they take. But that's just an example of how this will eventually affect a lot of the security that we have. And eventually we need to adapt our hardware for web inclusivity. For example, like creating two sets of controls, one for device and one for PC or mobile device, which is needed. And also creating a preset encryption protocols for connection with web, creating web access from this hardware itself, for example, from techless wheelchairs, which is really needed. And also to consider the output, what we're outputting is really needed when we consider what's being done. And also alternatives that can be done other than the controls that we currently have. Of course, like the alternative from the picture text, and also privacy in enabling accessibility is needed as well. So issue of no internet is also another thing that we need to consider, because sometimes we need to create more solutions such as thinking in other ways, and in websites especially, that we need that to be able to create more synchronization in other ways, and to be able to create more methods to be able to create more accessibility for people, such as, like I said before, for example, we can sync through button instead, but for offline, we can find other methods as well to deal with that. And of course, when we talk about cloud-based services, need more emphasis on simplification, and it needs to be more adapted to experienced technologies. We need to set up servers here and there, so that's the problem. We still have a lot of manuals. And of course, interoperability, which will lead to the terror of testing. Sometimes we really have a terror of testing when we try to test over a myriad of devices, IoT. That's why we use standardization. And of course, these are just some examples of assistive devices to cope, which is taken from Sazonov Newman's book of Fundamentals Information Applications. It's a sample of just some applications of what hardware has been worked on to be able to deal with this. So eventually we go into the big vision of all of this, smart city impact. We've seen a lot of cities work on this smart city vision, which is going to be quite a thing eventually that we'll see. So because this is really a big concept that we'll see in the future, and eventually it's being transitioned to a lot of cities as well. Eventually from the smart web 3.0, we'll see a lot of new developments as well from around us, airports, bus stations, traffic updates. So all of those are alerts that are dedicated to the IoT, and eventually we'll need to learn how to navigate all of those different case studies, and eventually create more accessible ways for people to be alerted from, for example, bus stations that are currently having buses, or traffic updates, whether it's good or not. And as you can see, for example, from the case study of the cars, you can see below there, they can navigate directly. And of course, the same accessibility needs to be, it's a must for people like this. We cannot just depend on people who may only enjoy these kinds of things, but we need to make it accessible for everyone. So in conclusion, accessibility needs to be over competitiveness. We need to prefer accessibility over competitiveness. And a lot of firms need to still focus on this instead of just focusing on competitiveness. We need to reform the web as needed, basically, in IoT websites. We've seen a lot of new developments recently in a lot of companies. For example, like Amazon's Alexa really helps a lot in being able to manage Amazon Web Services and basically from their voice recognition as opposed to needs to navigate the website. And basically, we can let tech develop and eventually we'll have a smart city for all, basically. That's the thing that we want to have in the end. So final piece of advice, remember the most important thing of IoT and accessibility is put yourself into the user's shoes. That's the most important thing, because you may not understand exactly what you need, but when you start to imagine what the person needs that you're targeting at, for example, if they're old or if they're blind, you may directly have a solution towards that. That's the most important thing in IoT, because you need to feel like having that disability. You need to really picture yourself in their shoes to be able to create the solutions that they really need. And that's the most important thing. That's the most important user experience study that can be done. And because you're the developer, it's up to you to do it. And you need to be able to create the optimal environment for you and them. And basically, you're the person who can do it yourself to be able to create that accessibility. So to end my talk, just a quote from W3C CEO Dr. Jeff Jaff. There are huge transformative opportunities, not only for mobile operators, but for all businesses if we can overcome the fragmentation of the IoT. As stewards of the open web platform, World Wide Web Consortium is in a unique position to create the royalty-free and platform-independent standards needed to achieve this goal. So we'll see this more often because they're also doing it. So that's the end of my talk. I'd like to just move on to questions now. So,
hey, Renaldi. So we are at a point where we've run out of time for questions. Which is no, that's not a criticism on you at all. You had a lot of good information in there. And I think it's important that we were able to get to all of that. So first, I want to thank you for taking the time, and you clearly put a lot of effort into the slides, and that's awesome. But I'm going to do a little bit of wrap up, and I want to read, well, so let me give a little bit of context. For each of the sessions, we pick the best tweet, comment, or question using the ID24 hashtag and give that person a 90-day JAWS license. And Charles Hall had a good comment where he noted that you mentioned auto alt text, an accessible integration of web IoT. And his comment was that we need more of this and we need standards for this. And knowing that there's the W3C Internet of Things Standards Group, I know they look at these kinds of things, but if you have a quick comment you want to offer on that before I do the rest of the wrap up, that'd be awesome.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it's something that we've recently been looking into as well. So it's definitely interesting to see that now the World Wide Web Consortium are also considering to move into those solutions as well. So I definitely think that in the future we'll see more of those solutions as well. Alt text is just the beginning. When algorithms are not exactly accurate yet at times, but eventually as more information is put into the web, yeah, there's definitely going to be more developments.
Yeah, well, I for one am looking forward to that for a variety of reasons, not just so it can read menus for me in restaurants as I continue to age, despite my best efforts. So anyway, I just want to remind everybody who is here, the ID24 is brought to you by the Paciello Group, and we've got kind support from Barclays and from the Center for Inclusive Design. You can find out more about them on our website in the sponsors section. And if you like this session, give a shout out to Renaldi and hit that like button, subscribe to the channel so that we can more easily let you know when we have future streams. And I think my time has been cut. No, wait, no, it was not cut. And I think that's it. So Renaldi, again, thank you for your time. And for everybody else, hang out for 10-ish minutes, and then we'll get the next talk going.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you, sir. Now I got to figure out how to turn this off.
Okay.
There's a button I have to press. I just don't know where it is.